Well, welcome to session 4 in our Connect Group journey through the values that make up the culture of King's Church. Great for us to take just a few moments and to look together at some of these deeper truths that actually express the behaviours that put together the culture of that which you experience and you bump up against in King's Church here in Aberdeen. And so today we're back again into that foundational blueprint of the first century church as we look at some of the aspects of their priorities and behaviours and choices that we might find again one of these other values that are important for us as a local church. And again we see a group of diverse men and women from all over the area around Israel gathering together and becoming that first century church. And how they did that and what happened in their lives to express that is what we're going to look at today. The issue that we're looking for at today, or the value that we're looking at, is the one of community, where the coming together of different and diverse men and women shape and mold and make and maintain a community that builds, I guess, what it means to be church in not only the first century, but also for us today in 2021. I suppose you would all agree that we're emerging out of what has been the biggest onslaught and challenge to community that I've known in my lifetime, and I'm sure the same for all of us, where the recent pandemic has resulted in us not actually promoting community, but in many ways outlawing community, as we've been encouraged to socially distance, as we've encouraged to personally isolate, as we've been encouraged really to bring fragmentation to our society. And we know that the repercussions of that, I'm sure, are yet to be unfolding in terms of mental health and societal well-being. But we want to look today at what is the opposite of that, and what is it that we can do as men and women. What does it take for us to build community? What does it take for us to express that value individually and collectively? And so we're going to look again at the scripture that is fundamental and foundational for us here at King's. I believe that humans are all designed to be in community. We are made by God to live collectively together, not isolated on our own. I believe it's a creation model for community that God speaks of right in the very first chapter of Genesis. He says this in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" That "let us make man in our image" is that creation model that God is actually presenting to you and to me of how the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, different facets, are all diverse facets that come together to express community in the Godhead. It's a creation model, but it's also a creation mandate for all of us. And again in Genesis chapter 2 verse 18 it says, "The Lord God said, 'It is not good for a man to be alone, and for a woman to be alone.' And he said to Adam right at the very start, 'I will make a helper suitable for him.'" And I think God is saying right at the very start, when the creation was made and when it's the story of beginnings, he wants to put a stake in the ground and say, community is what I want human beings to live in. Community is what the human experience should be. We're not designed to be on our own. We're not designed to live and get through life just on our own. We're designed to be in community, just as God himself is in community. And that community is is horizontal with ourselves, is also vertical with God. And so we want to take a moment just to observe and take a look at what are some definitions of community. Then how does the Bible describe community? I want us to see a cautionary tale from the older part of the Bible, the Old Testament, of what are some of the divisive elements of community that actually show a counterfeit community. And then we'll come at the end really to what then can we do, what decisions do we need to make individually and collectively that will help us build community. But before we do that then, let's read Acts 2:42 to 47 again. Here's what it says, just to remind you again. "They devoted themselves," it says, "to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those that were being saved. And as we've said previously, it was very clear that something was happening among them. Something was happening among them. Lives were being forever changed. Destinies were being altered. Day by day, they were coming together and meeting together and doing this thing called fellowship. Every day they were gathering together, building community, praising God together, worshiping together, giving together, celebrating together, and gathering together in each other's homes for hospitality, for sharing the common meal. Something was happening among them. But that behavior that we see and described that was happening among them was because something was happening within them. There were changes and decisions and choices and priorities that they were making that were, I guess, the expression of values that they held deep within their hearts. Values that had emerged out of what they knew about God, what they knew about the church, what they knew about themselves, were actually the fuel that was almost setting ablaze within them that said, these are the priorities we need to make. These are the values that we're going to hold. And because of that which was happening within them shaped what was happening among them. And of course, as we said the last time we were together, made a difference what was going on around them. And so when we look at that passage that we just read, the whole passage is in the plural. It's never I or me or my. It's always us and we and they and their. 9 times in those few verses, the pronoun they or their is mentioned. They were together, they sold property, they met together, they had everything in common. They met in the temple courts, they gave to anyone who had need, they broke bread in their homes, they ate with glad and sincere hearts. I guess what we're trying to put across here is that they did everything they could to make and maintain the value of community. In this burgeoning and increasing group of men and women from all diverse backgrounds, they were doing everything that they could to make sure that community was a value that was so deeply entrenched in them that it was never going to be shaken. So what's the definition of community? Well, here's what the Oxford Dictionary says. Community describes a community as a group of people with diverse characteristics who are linked by social ties, share common perspectives, and engage in joint action in a geographical location. It can also mean those that are a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common, or who share or hold certain attitudes and interests in common. But I think there's a richer description that we find in the New Testament description of the church. A richer description that is important for you and I to get a handle on when we talk about community. What do we actually mean? You know, it says that they devoted themselves to fellowship. And the Greek word that we all know is this word called koinonia. And I remember somebody jokingly said, this fellowship stuff is about all the different fellows in a ship. And I guess we can laugh at that, but actually there's some truth in that little illustration. Because it says that this koinonia, this fellowship, this community, this coming together, this partnership and sharing in life together is like a different bunch of fellows in a ship. You see, what I'm saying is they were all together in this boat from diverse backgrounds, all rowing in the same direction, but at different places in the ship, some at the front, some at the back, some with different levels of skill and responsibility. But all were going in the same direction, all were rowing, all were contributing to what it meant to be together. All of them had a different perspective, and yet they were all fellows in the same ship, guided and led by one goal, one direction, one purpose, all of them expressing unity, endeavoring to get where they're going to get to. And I appreciate it's a funny little illustration, but actually it contains some of the truth and the richer expression of what community is. You know, that fellowship that Luke is describing, that first century church, that koinonia, expresses that association, that community, communion. It talks about joint participation. The original Greek word that koinos that it uses, or is derived from, is all about being a partner, a sharer, a shareholder, a companion. I guess in short, it's that shared community that involves deep and close-knit friendships and partnerships among people, where a group of people care about each other more than they do about random people around, where those relationships result in the development of trust. And of course, once you have trust, which is the key ingredient, trust is the key that unlocks that whole reality of collaboration, of sharing, of supporting each other, of hope, of safety, and of so much more. And so there's a much richer reality about what community is, as we find it in this term, koinonia. We need to take a look and take a moment also just to explore and to understand. But people can come together in community for a variety of different things and in a variety of different ways, and not all the expression of community can be positive. And you can gather in a community that can be divisive and actually can be unhelpful and unhealthy. And there's an interesting story in the older part of the Bible. It's in 1 Samuel in chapter 22. If you have your Bible open in your group, then why don't you have a look at it? It's a tale of two kings, of King David and King Saul, and how both of them were looking to build the value and the quality of community into the group that was gathering around them. David was the king in waiting for what was ahead of him, while Saul was the king who was always watching what was behind him and watching what was behind his back. And both of them we see in that one chapter are expressions of a community. One that is very negative, we're going to see in a moment. Things that you and I need to watch out for. Stuff that we need to say, whoa, if that's what this community is built on, I'm not going to be part of it. Let me read to you a little bit of the contrasting story that is there. In that counterfeit community that Saul was building, it's written in 1 Samuel 22 verses 6. It says, "Now that when Saul heard David and his men had been discovered, Saul was seated, spear in hand, under a tamarisk tree on the hill at Gibeah, with all his officials standing at his side. He said to them, 'Listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you have all conspired against me? No one tells me anything, and no one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse, with David. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me as he does today.'" Just in that short snapshot, that short dialogue that you can see between Saul and the people that are around him, you can see that the community that he was building was a counterfeit community full of behaviors and values that we need to be very careful if we ever come across and ever think that community is being built. They're very negative, and they're good warning signs for us. You see, that community, well, let me put it this way, that the elements that were in there, the values that were in there trying to make this community, number one, the negative one, was position. The whole thing was about position. You couldn't be part of this community unless you were given a position. That was what he was expressing and declaring and inviting the men that were around him, saying, "Hey, if I give you a position, will you be part of my community?" There was a whole series of politics were going on. Lots of people were conspiring one against another. There was no submission. There was a lot of tail-bearing. There was a lot of backstabbing, vying for position. The whole thing was fragmented. There was politics. And if you ever come across politics in a community, I would encourage you to make sure you don't become part of it. There was also pretense. There was no openness. There was no transparency. There was no accountability. Everything was about secret communication, telling only what was needed. And we read that in the few verses that we read. That pretense is not a value that should be within building of community. It was a passive community. There was no ownership. Nobody was taking responsibility. No mutual concern or compassion. Each was just holding his own and getting his own position. And of course, what happens there is it's a community built on pressure that you must do and you must undertake. And if you don't, then you're not part of this community. That's manipulation and domination. And those are negative currencies that should never be in a community. So I wanted to give you those so that you are forewarned and aware of some of the negative values that can be placed also in a counterfeit community. But that's not what we see. We see the contrast when David is described in verses 1, 2 to 3. It says that when David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam, when his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. And all those that were in distress and debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. And about 400 men were there with him. What a contrast, just in these few verses, of two different communities and different qualities and different values that made up that as it were, the community value that they held. And David, of course, was demonstrating values that are still able to build community today, still those that are important for us. You see, the people that were gathering around him were those that were distressed. They had come to the end of their own way. They were, I guess, rubbed raw with life. Life was very difficult. They were in debt. that they'd taken from their future to pay for their present and their past. It says they were distressed. They were just unhappy within and with life around them. I guess it's a little bit like the diverse situation that we find around us. People coming from all different backgrounds and situations and challenges and difficulties, looking for community and healthy and good community. And if we can celebrate the value of community, if we can deliver the behaviors, then for you and for me, it will build a great sense of community. David was so different. You see, his was an inclusive community, not exclusive. That nobody was excluded. It was for every, and that for me is what one of the internal behaviors that you and I need to have if we're going to build great community. It was supportive and not dismissive. His father and family were there. They were supporting one another to build great community, and that's what we need to be looking for. It was adhesive and not divisive. It was that sense of loyalty and sticking together through the good times and the difficult times. And we know the story of how these people in this Old Testament illustration became David's mighty men. It was effective and not passive. All of them gathered together to help and to build and to fight together, to run together and to do what was necessary. And of course, they became David's mighty men. And I love that picture, that it was distinctive and not elusive. It was no sham. It was no counterfeit community. It was known as David's mighty men. We're going to look, just as we follow through, into this first century blueprint, this first century church that were distinctive and clear in who they were and what values they held, and how the behaviors and the choices and the priorities outworked those values to create a culture into which community was one of those so powerful values. But for David, it was distinctive and not elusive. Could it be that for here in King's Church, we have also that distinctive community value that is inclusive, that is actually supportive, that is actually adhesive, that is actually effective? I pray and I believe that that's where we already are, but it's important for us to be encouraged. So what are the steps that you and I need to take? What are the decisions that we need to make individually that will build community? Well, if we go back into Acts 2, 42 to 47 again, there are some easy and simple illustrations for us of decisions and behaviors that we need to step into, that we need to, I guess, prioritize and make in our life if we are going to be, as it were, shareholders, part of that fellowship, part of that building together. Number one is that we carry individual responsibility for the bigger reality. It says they devoted themselves. That meant that collectively they devoted themselves, but it also meant that individually they devoted themselves to fellowship. That individually they carried the responsibility for this bigger reality. And it's important for all of us, as we're talking in our groups today, to think, well, what is my individual responsibility that I need to carry for the bigger reality of building community? Number two was the commitment to laying down individuality for the building of unity. Let me say that again. There needs to be a commitment of laying down our individuality for the building of unity. Verse 44 says that all the believers were together. You know and I know how challenging sometimes it is to constantly be laying down our individuality, what we want, what we personally, what we need, what we see as the priority, what we see as the most important thing. But I love the reality that is described here in this first century church, that they intentionally made a commitment that said, you know what, I need to daily, weekly, every opportunity lay down my individuality, that we collectively together will build unity and be together. Number three, that our concern for others has to be greater than our consideration for self. If we're going to build great community, if we're going to do behaviors that demonstrate this fantastic value, then our concern for others has to be greater than our consideration of self. Verse 45 says that they sold what needed to give to those in need. We talked about generosity before, but generosity spills out of the desire to build great community, where what we're basically saying is your needs are greater than my desires. That what you need and how I can help you is greater. My concern and consideration for you is greater than my self-focus. Number four, that we need to be consistent in our decision making. And I love what it says in verse 46. It says, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts and in their homes. It wasn't a one-off. It wasn't we do a thing called community on a Sunday when we gather to worship. We do a thing on a midweek when we gather to small group. Community was so embedded in their lifestyle that it was a constant decision and a consistent decision they were making. It was part of their mindset, I guess, that I wonder, can we do this together rather than doing it on our own? I appreciate that there are so many things that we need to do on our own. We need to find that place to pray and to seek God and to hear from Him on our own. There are times that we need to study on our own. There are times that we need to work on our own. But I guess what I'm encouraging us and I suppose challenging us to think about is just that consistency in decision making in our minds. It says, if I have an opportunity, why don't I take somebody with me on the journey of where I'm going? Why don't I do this together with people rather than on my own? And number 5, the last one, is that cooperation comes from a heart that cares. Cooperation together comes and is embedded in a heart that cares. Verse 46 says that they did all this gathering together with glad and sincere hearts. You know, that means that there was no duplicity in their motivation. There was no second guessing why they were doing something. It was credible, it was authentic, it was real, that actually deep in their hearts they cared for each other, and that's why they built great community. That's why their behaviors were the way they were. That's why they gathered together, because they genuinely cared. As we are unpacking some of these truths in our Connect group, I wonder if we can take a moment just to celebrate community, the community that we have. I wonder if we can take a moment just to think again about some of the negative qualities of community that you and I have experienced. But let's take more time to think about, so from David's inclusivity and from David's qualities that he's describing, and from this first century church, what are the elements that we can think about, be challenged by, encouraged by, and make decisions on that will help us as a church together to build great community? Thanks so much.